Thank you, everyone, very much for coming. I'm Peter Loewen. I'm the director here at the Munk School, but I'm really just along for the ride with all of you today to see David Johnston, who was, of course, our Governor General from 2010 to 2017. He's had many other jobs before that, including being a professor at the University of Toronto, president of Western.
Straight downhill from there, Peter.
Come on now, president of Waterloo. Before that, principal of McGill. He has done every hard job the government's asked him to do, and if you read today's paper, he's got another difficult one. And he is, just for my money, the most remarkable Canadian. So it's wonderful, Mr. Johnston, to have you with us today. I really appreciate your being here. And we're going to talk to you about your book. Before we do that, I do want to acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're really lucky to be here, fortunate to be able to work and to live and to thrive on this part of Turtle Island. Mr. Johnston, you've written a book. You've written many books. Your latest book is called Empathy, Turning Compassion into Action. And I just want to have you take us for a tour through the book. So right off the top, what is empathy to you? Why is it an important capacity? And why did you write a whole book about it?
Well, first of all, Peter, call me David, as we do when we're having a cup of coffee together, and when you're doing such wonderful work with your scholars for the Leaders Debates Commission. We've developed a wonderful friendship there. And secondly, to say I've come home, I spent 6 marvelous years in the law faculty at the University of Toronto, and just have the fondest memories of this great institution. It's great to be back here. Why did we write a book about empathy, and what is it? Well, empathy is not sympathy. I feel sorry for you. Empathy is, I see your plight, and I come and walk hand in hand and walk on your shoes. It's that compassion turning into positive action, etc. It's very interesting, the derivation of the word. I'm told by scholarly people that it came into the English vocabulary only about 120 years ago from the German word empfurling. And that was not quite empathy in the sense of sympathy for another person, compassion, and walking in their shoes, but it was become totally immersed in something that affected you very passionately, like a beautiful piece of music or an artwork that made enormous sense to you, or perhaps a poem that touched you deeply. So much so that there's a story by one of the chroniclers of Shakespeare's plays of the impact of those plays on human beings. And they tell the story that took place, I think, in Idaho around about 1880. And at a traveling show in a farming town, they were showing Othello. And in one of the famous scenes, Iago persuades Othello that Desdemona, his fiancée, was unfaithful. Total misrepresentation, total lie. And Othello, in anger, shot the unfortunate Desdemona. And so moved by this, passionate about it, that a cowboy in the audience got up and shot the actor through the head. Now, that's empathy taken a bit too far, but it illustrates being passionately involved. And for me, that notion of moving from a sympathetic consideration of someone to taking steps to aid that person's situation is very important. Why did we write this book? It was the 5th of a series of books that we did while I was in Rideau Hall, or was generated out of that unusual lens. When I was sworn in October of 2010, the title of my installation address was A Smart and Caring Nation, a call to service. And what does that mean, being both smart and caring as a nation, and smart and caring as a community, etc.? Both adjectives are important. And it became important to me, occupying that non-partisan role with no particular power to do anything by way of taxing and spending, etc., but trying to reinforce the fundamental values which makes this country a very special and I think a very blessed place, beginning with the Constitution itself and how it provides protection, but how we maintain a civility with one another so that our communities flourish, etc. And so the first book was called The Idea of Canada. It's my habit I write letters in the morning. If anybody can read my handwriting once they've received them, that's a good thing. But Kellyanne, my wonderful assistant, does the transcription and puts them into a type form so they can see. But I am a believer in letter writing. As a university president for 27 years, I'd spend a half an hour or so each morning writing letters to colleagues who'd done something worthy, etc. And that carried over. So this book of The Idea of Canada was to about 50 different people, 40 of whom were alive, who had values that were important to me as fundamental Canadian values, like trust and empathy, et cetera. And then another 10 who were deceased, but write to them posthumously for what they represented. So that was the first book. Then the next two we were on innovation, one for adults, one for children, collecting stories of Canadian innovators, because innovation is important. That's just doing things better and having that habit. The adult book is in most of the high schools in the country, and the children's book in most of the primary schools, and we had 1,000 lesson plans done for teachers to put legs on those stories. And then the next book was called Trust, which we published about 2 years ago, really emanating from my concern about diminishing trust in public institutions and so on. Empathy was the last one, and trust and empathy are two sides of the same coin, I think, Peter, with hope arising in it. And for me, it was the most difficult one, because to try to understand empathy, I had to come to understand myself, and I tell more stories at Bearing the Soul that I ordinarily would do it and would have done in the earlier stories.
Yeah, this is, I appreciate you putting it that way, because for me, what had a big impact on me reading the book, among other things, was how personal you were in the book. And you talk about, you know, being a boy growing up in Sault Ste. Marie. I grew up in North Bay, so I know a little bit about the Soo.
Just down the road.
Just down the road, and it's a long way from Sault Ste. Marie to Rideau Hall. But you talk about the love, the force of your mom, how much of an impact she had on you, but you're also very candid about your father, who was an alcoholic, say in the book, was sober later in life, and it was really interesting to me, and it moved me a lot to read about how you learned about empathy from both of them. Yeah. And can you share a bit of that with us, if you would?
Yeah, that was the Bearing the Soul part. Going back into my history, my dad had a problem with the bottle, and so he was unemployed for all my high school years and before that, and while I was in university. So I realized about age eight that if I wanted a new pair of blue jeans or a bike, you have a job and you earn the money for that. And I did not have any hardship. I had part-time jobs and summer jobs. I did everything. And Sault Ste. Marie was like a village. It takes a village to raise a child. And that village raised me through enormous kindness, including the part-time jobs. My father had a problem. Later in life, it diminished somewhat. And there was another side to him. And it was so good that I could see the other side, because my grandmother would say, it's the devil in your dad that creates this problem. As our children came along, my dad struck up a wonderful rapport with them. In my case, I was a good athlete, and my dad would be at the local tavern bragging about his son being in the headlines in the sports pages for doing whatever. And he never, ever saw me play a game. And I watch my children play sports, and I'm crazy. I'm cheering them on and so on, no matter. But he missed that joy, and I began to think, you know, how sad for him. But he made it up with my children, his grandchildren, my children. And he had a custom. When we come to his house, he had a mason jar filled with pennies. And it was up on the mantelpiece, chalk-free. And he'd bring the kids over, and he'd say to them, now, we're going to do something very special. I want you to stop and think about how you can be kind to your sisters. And then we'll open up this jar, and you put your hand in the jar and take out as many pennies as you possibly can. And the older ones, they were pretty good at it. And the last one, Sam, our baby, came along. When she was about 3, she was into the jar habit, but her hand wasn't strong enough to turn the top. He would do that. When her hand was small, she couldn't get many pennies out. So he would say, oh, that didn't work, because I asked the other girls to take a few seconds before they put their hand in the jar to think about how I'm going to be kind to my sisters. Think about that again. And she'd kind of stop and pause. And then he'd put his hand over her hand and help her reach into the jar and come out with even more pennies than her sisters had in the pocket. That was the kindness of my father. And I learned from that there can be two sides of a person, and I saw that special side. My mother's case, she was a nurse's aide, really supporting the family, and she actually went blind through detached retina, so she was not able to do that job. But from her, it was a wonderful resilience of taking adversity and moving on past it. Yeah. The other thing I should say, Peter, is I learned empathy really from the kindness of people around me. At age 14, for example, I played hockey, and everybody played hockey in Sault Ste. Marie. You learn to skate before you learn to walk. and there was a Toronto Maple Leaf scout coming to the one indoor arena on a Friday night. I get a call the day before from the owner of a local sporting goods store, whom I didn't know well. He said, come to my store an hour and a half before the game, I've got something for you. I came and he had a new pair of skates for me, Bauer Special. I had never had a new piece of hockey equipment of any kind. I scored 3 goals that night, it was all the skates. And this is a man, why would he do that? Because here was a kid, that was trying to make his way, etc. He gave him a new pair of skates. The skates hurt over and over again in my growing up. And then Sharon, my wife, was my first date at age 13. I was her first date in high school at age 13. And I learned love from her and learned kindness and empathy. And then as we had our children, they taught me empathy.
Yeah, would you mind speaking just I don't want you to bare your soul too much tonight, but would you mind speaking a little bit about that? Because I've got young kids who you were really kind enough to spend a bit of time with just before.
We were just saluting with one another. They were learning how to salute. I said Governors General have to learn how to salute.
It's very special for me.
And they salute well. I said, you're going to be Governor General.
Thank you so much for that. But thank you so much. And it becomes clear that you learned a lot from your kids. Can you talk about that? About empathy? Yeah.
Again and again and again, and we describe some of those stories in the book, probably not enough, and from my wife. But one of the instances we recount is quite, the trust book, the dedication was to children who offer their trust implicitly in the full expectation of fairness. Offer their trust implicitly in the full expectation of fairness. A kind of unconscious thing that is there. And the inscription to the empathy book is to my wife and my children, my grandchildren, who've taught me empathy. Our eldest daughter was 4 years old. We were in Cambridge, England, where I was on a 6-month sabbatical leave writing a legal book. And we lived in the little village of Girton, 3 kilometers outside of Cambridge. And we went to the local church, the Anglican church, and it was over 1,000 years old. And I think it was the 3rd or 4th Sunday we were there, and we were in the middle pew, and our 4-year-old was with us, and she had her coloring crayons and a couple pieces of paper. We settled down on the pew, and she was beginning to draw things. And then the door at the back opened up, and in the back door came a very disheveled elderly man walking with 2 canes, poorly dressed, etc., and sat down in the back pew. And she watched this for a little while, and the minister was giving his sermon, and she picked up some of her crayons, and she went with the piece of paper to this back pew. And she was going back. I thought, where is she going? Well, she's okay. She settles into the back pew and says hello to this gentleman, and then she continues to draw, etc. And then she comes back to her pew about 5 minutes later, and I said, dear, you didn't bring your paper back. She says, no, I gave it to my friend. I said, the man in the back row, and said, yeah. I said, well, what was on the paper? She said, I drew a picture of him. And I said, well, why did you do that? She says, he needed a friend. And so I gave him a picture of me that would take home from a 4-year-old. Goes to that back pew, sits down, draws a picture, says goodbye. He needed a friend. Not bad. Her father learned something.
Why is Samuel de Champlain your favorite Governor General?
There's a story behind that, like so many of my explanations, Peter. The day my appointment as Governor General was announced in the Senate chamber, I was given a book by a great friend of mine, Paul Davidson. Some of you know Paul as the President, Chief Executive Officer of Universities Canada. And he said, you're a student of history. I want you to read David Fisher Hamlin's Champlain's Dream. That's the title of the book. Fisher is a historian at Yale University, an American writing about Canada, Pulitzer Prize winner, and describes Champlain in his dream. And I had to unlearn all of the English history I learned about Canada in reading Champlain's Dream, because my vision of Champlain was a French conquistador who came to Canada with the credence of the French king to plant the fleur-de-lis, to Christianize the indigenous people here, to take as many furs and fish and gold, if they can find it in China, and send it back to France, a conquistador. Totally wrong. As David Fisher explains, Champlain, first of all, learned a number of the indigenous languages. Secondly, made peace with the indigenous people. Thirdly, his first community in Mount Royal in Nova Scotia would not have survived the first winter had he not learned from the local Micmac people one fresh meat, and 2, a tea that was made from evergreen needles that we now learn had vitamin C and it stopped scurvy. That's how that village survived. Them reaching out to him. And he made peace with all of the indigenous tribes with whom he had contact right through the Great Lakes, up past Sault Ste. Marie, or nearly there, North Bay. Except for the Iroquois, because they were the enemy of all the others. And even for them, he arranged a friendship and established a peace with others. But his idea was people from pluralistic backgrounds living in harmony, having the respect for your neighbor, that you learned their culture and worked with them, that you shared things. He had the rule of law applying. Several of his lieutenants actually had a plot to murder him at one point. When he discovered it, rather than executing them, he had a trial and then sent them back to France to be retried again, that the rule of law would function there. And that was Champlain, and that was his dream for Canada. And of course, that's the dream that most of us have for Canada today, a pluralistic society that is empathetic, that builds trust, and builds communities where everyone can survive. I have other favorite governors general, each for different things. Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir, is a great a person I admire very much, someone whom I did a letter to in Letters to a Nation. As I come into my office each morning, the names of all of the previous governors generals are on a wooden panel above the door, and I see Buchan Tweedsmuir, and he wrote 110 books during his career, and he was never a full-time writer. And as I'm getting through a stack of stuff in my paper, I'd say Buchan would have that finished by 10 o'clock in the morning. He'd be writing another book, 39 Steps or something like that, or The History of World War I. Vanier was another man I admired very much, partly for his faith. He was very deeply religious and carried Christian values. But he was also a person who said, public service is the noblest of all profession. And I never failed to meet with public servants that I don't quote Vanier.
How did you feel when you saw all those names and then you became Governor General? Because when I heard you become a Governor General, it seemed like it was
very
a very
small,
fitting appointment.
crawl under the table. Why are you here? And probably to some extent it kind of stirred into action. You have got a job to do, buddy, and get on at it. And other people have wrestled with these problems and done pretty well. We hope you will and live up to the standards that they set. Yeah, but it's like any institution, Peter. You come into whether it's a new university or a new faculty or whatever, that you try to leave it better than you found it, and you take inspiration from the people who've gone before, who in fact have met that test. They've left it better than they found it.
You were a scholar of the law. You are a scholar of the law and a dean of law, and you argue in the book that there's a deep connection between empathy and not the law, but the rule of law.
Yeah.
And we might think off the top end that the law is the last place for feelings.
Sure.
But you argue that there is this deep connection. Can you walk us through that?
Hugely, and I would say empathy and trust going together. And I begin with the distinction between the rule of law and justice. We say we're a rule of law country. This is a fair justice place, etc. You're fine. The law is predictable. But a lot of countries say they abide by the rule of law. The Chinese do. They say we are a rule of law country. We have a very clear constitution. Many countries write new constitutions. They're elegant. They've got all the right phrases and so on, all the right protections. But they're just words on a piece of paper. How are they executed? They're executed against the measurement, the matrix of justice. And justice is not a set of statements in a code, criminal code, civil code, or a statute, or legislation, or a precedent case. Justice is a set of values with fairness at the root. So the rule of law must embrace the values of justice, that is fairness, or it's not worth the paper it's written on. So you have to make that distinction. So if I were starting another law school tomorrow, and I loved being a law school dean because you were close to the students. I always taught when I was dean, and I did for a while at principal at McGill. I would, if above the door of the law school would read, is this law just? Is law just, and is this law just? I'd also ask the question, does this law work to create fairness, etc.? And to answer those questions, you have to understand that specific rule of law. Why was it created in the first place? What were the circumstances? Was it just in the first place? Maybe so, maybe not. And if it were just in the first place, is it just now? Has it adopted to the circumstances? And that's where the question, does this law work? Work for what? that it meets the standards of justice to be fair. And so I would say in the rule of law chapter, while I thought it was so important to have that, was to say that the rule of law must be informed by justice, and we as citizens must be constantly alert to whether a particular law is just and fair, and if not, do our best to remedy that. I could say more, but I'll cease and desist there.
Well, do you think we're becoming a more just and fair society?
In some ways, yes. I mean, take where we've spent our lives, Peter, in universities. When I graduated from high school, I think my entering class in Sault Ste. Marie was something like 350 young people in grade 9. I think of that class, we had grade 13 in those days, I think only about 30 went on to university. And that's dramatically changed. We are now the country in the world that has the highest percentage of people with post-secondary education. That's quite an accomplishment. And by and large, we're not perfect, but we have an education system that is unmarred around the world. And by and large, our universities are of high quality, they're accessible. Students will dispute this a little bit, but by and large, they're affordable with some things. That's a juster society. I think that the steps we are now making in reconciliation with our Indigenous people, where we have been anything but just and fair over 150 years, for me are very optimistic. I look at young people now coming from Indigenous backgrounds and much more opportunity for education. It wasn't until, what would it be, 1957, 58, where someone, a young person on a reserve, would not go to study at a university in the extraordinary situation where they could get exemption from the Indian age, and they would. Roberta Jameson, a name you would know, was a law student of ours at Western, graduating in 1974. She was the first woman from a reserve to receive a legal education. That was as recent as 1974, but I think we've made strides there. In other respects, I think we've fallen back. We have seen the Edelman Trust that measures trusts in societies over the last 20 years, where we fell into the distruster category of a majority of our population does not trust government, business, NGOs, or media, especially for the news. And that's decline is something one worries about. It's something that motivated the trust book. But I'm very optimistic of this country. If I look around the world, I don't know of another country that tries as hard as we do to be a just and fair society. We have lots of imperfections, et cetera, and have to work on, but I think the vast majority of Canadians believe in those fundamental values and are anxious to see us do even better.
We've got some questions from some of our students here. I'm going to ask to get a microphone to them in the second row, and just before we do that, I've got one last question before we turn to them, and it is about the correction now on how we rebuild trust.
Yeah.
And I think it's very fair to say that you were well known as a leader to be open, caring, to be optimistic, and to be a leader who there was a lot of trust in the organizations that you ran, from universities through to being Governor General. What can you share with us about how you think governments and other public organizations can rebuild that trust that citizens are losing?
Well, I jest, Peter, that my next great crusade will be to establish the Tea Party in Canada. How about that, Tea Party in Canada? I spent 4 years studying in Boston, so I know a thing or two about tea parties in the U.S. But my Tea Party would have 3 T's, and they are truth, transparency, and trust all go together. You start with that, and you stay with that, and you'll get a long way, I think, in terms of building a society which people can trust and can have confidence in, et cetera. But in the trust book, and again in the empathy book, we asked the question, how do you have a trustworthy society? How do you have an empathetic society? How do you have a smart and caring nation? And kind of that's the end product. And then we said, well, you know, to have a trustworthy country and a trustworthy government, you have to have trustworthy regions, enterprises, communities, et cetera. And how do you get those? From trustworthy individuals. So we reversed the arc of the book, and the first third of each of those 2 books become, how can I become a trustworthy individual? How can I become an empathetic individual? How do we mark that? Second part, how do we develop communities, association, enterprises, businesses, et cetera, which are trustworthy and empathetic? And then the third part of the book is how do we do that nationwide. And we try to be kind of practical, and we have specific suggestions or recommendations throughout the books on how we take those particular actions.
I'm going to invite Alina to stand up, introduce yourself. We're so proud of the students we have here at the Munk School, so I'll ask them to introduce themselves and go ahead and ask a question.
I should tell you, now I'm terrified. My knees are shaking because these smart students are going to cross-examine me. I'll stand up so I can hear you.
Oh my God, thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Elena Voynich. I'm a Master of Public Policy Year 1 student. And I'm also a Ukrainian lawyer. So my question...
A Ukrainian lawyer.
Right.
We have wonderful admiration for your country and the leadership.
Thank you very much, sir.
And we are there to see justice done.
Thank you, and thank you for your support. So my question will be about empathy, and it's easy to feel empathy for some people, like for those who became disadvantaged by chance. But what about those who made wrong choices in their lives, or maybe even harm society? So how can we develop empathy for this type of people, both at personal level, but what's more important, at the level of society, and what kind of approaches can we use, or what messages can we say to achieve this?
Well, that's the test of any healthy society. That is how well you are in reaching out to the most vulnerable people in your population, especially those who perhaps are outcast for some reason or another to reach over. I'm a great admirer of the late Queen. And I wrote a chapter of a book giving some comments on her personal qualities. There were three things that I found so appealing about her. One was her natural graciousness, and a very practical, empathetic person, very kind and thoughtful with a great sense of humor. The second thing, she epitomized the leader as servant, the leader as servant better than anyone I know. And the third was her values. Now, they sprang out of her Christian religion, which was very important to her, but she was very open to the other religions and would point out that almost all of the great religions of the world have as their fundamental love thy neighbor, or do unto your neighbor as you do unto yourself. And she would give, once a year, she'd actually have a public statement or a Christmas message. And she always drew from her Christian heritage. And her favorite story was the Good Samaritan. Those of you who know your New Testament will know that, of a merchant who was traveling 2,000 years ago in the roads of Israel, and he was set upon by thieves and beaten and left near death in a ditch. And shortly thereafter, a Pharisee, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish religion at that time, came walking by and saw him and turned his head and walked on, left him. Shortly thereafter, a scribe, they were the lawyers in Jewish society, also of the same king, came by and looked at him and rushed on. So, not worth my time, etc. But then a Samaritan came along. The Samaritans were enemies of the Jewish people. They were a hostile group, considered that you have nothing to do with them and don't trust them. That Samaritan saw this man, went and bound up his wounds, took him to an inn, paid for his time there, and left him as a whole man. And that was the Good Samaritan, reaching out to someone not of his tribe, not of his kinship, who needed help. David Brooks is the editorialist in the New York Times that I read regularly, and one of his books is called The Two Mountains. He says the first mountain is the mountain that you marvelous people who are high achievers climb up, and you meet all of the expectations of accomplishment and so on. He said if you're really lucky, as you're making your way up the first mountain, you look across the valley and you'll see a second mountain where other people are toiling up with more difficulty, and some perhaps particularly oppressed like you. If you're really lucky, you'll cross the valley and you'll take their hand and help them walk up the other side of that valley. And if you do, says Brooks, what used to be satisfaction, maybe a sense of happiness of your achievements in your first mountain, you'll have a sense of joy in that second mountain and being reached out. And besides that, your society works a whole lot better when you can reach across and help the Samaritans. And for me, that's a big index of Canadians. For example, Sharon and I would travel to towns and villages across the country, and we loved it. And I'd always try to assess the number of volunteers in that community, because that's a very good indicator of the health of a community. If the number of volunteers was higher than the normal on a per capita basis, that was healthy. If it was lower, it was not healthy at all. And often, a small number of volunteers means that you're not reaching out to the people who really need help in your community.
Thank you very much. Giancarlo.
Thank you very much for attending today and for answering our questions. My name is Giancarlo. I'm a Master of Global Affairs.
Do you come from away? Do you come from away, Giancarlo?
All the way in Stouffville.
All the way? All the way?
All the way in Markham, Stouffville.
Oh, that's a long way away.
About an hour and a half train.
Yeah, a little hard by sled dog.
Sorry about that. I haven't had the pleasure of reading your most recent book. I read your book on trust and I loved it. It strikes me that my question is going to be about the last section and the nationwide scaling up of this empathy.
Yeah.
When I was reading about the description and talking about the transformative power of listening and caring, it struck me as this being very relevant to federalism in Canada.
Sure.
And the value of empathy in underpinning and underrooting federalism. And so my question is, how do you see the relationship between empathy and federalism in terms of public policy making and some of the challenges we have? And do you have any thoughts on how we can bolster federalism using empathy in Canada?
Yeah. Well, I think the first lesson is learn to be more civil with one another than we ordinarily are, rather than having this context of, grab as much money as you can from the federal government and then go on and ask for more. That's not to pillage provincial premiers anyway, but we really do need civility in politics to get important things done and focus on those. I guess the second thing I would say is that for any kind of getting together and working in a harmonious way, you have to understand the other side, the other person, and what are their particular goals and needs. And the best kind of bargains are always one where both parties leave the table having had a win, and not just an immediate win, but a long-term win. So I think your question may also have had something to do with international treaty negotiation. You want to go into those saying, what is the other side attempting to get? And what is important for me? And then try to build concentric circles where your circle of interests move a little bit larger and my circle of interests move a little bit larger. And all of a sudden we've got a concentric sphere. He said, we can't quite solve that and we can't solve this, but we sure can do something about this. One of the really thoughtful, useful things I did was in 79? I was asked to chair the National Roundtable on Sustainable Development, Economic Development and Environmental Protection. And we had a roundtable of 16 people, 4 cabinet ministers, including Michael Wilson, a great graduate of this university, Minister of Finance, 3 others. And then we had 4 people from environmental groups, and we had 4 CEOs of business, and we had 4 people with backgrounds like mine, academics and public service and so on. And it took about 2 or 3 meetings to develop a trust amongst those. I remember Harvey Andre coming in one day, the Minister of Energy, saying to environmental folks, look, there were some public pronouncements about our last meeting that were embarrassing, and you could be Lech Walesa or Cardinal Richelieu. Walesa was then the leader of the Polish dissident movement that ultimately pushed the government out, but pilloried it for good reason while he was there. Cardinal Richelieu was the public servant behind the throne of one of the Louis that really got things done because he could bring the interests together. And our environmental friends took a recess for about 10 minutes. They came back and said, I think we'll work with Cardinal Richelieu. And we did. And our discussions then became confidential. And our cabinet ministers became much more forthright. And we developed a trust where the concentric circles really came together. And for me, that was wonderful. First of all, as a round table. Don't have horizontal tables. Round tables, you all face one another. And then secondly, you express what it is that your particular needs are. And I do. And if we get some kind of understanding, guess what? At the end of it, we have a deal that is both empathetic and trustworthy and will land for a long time.
Thank you very, very much. Aditya.
Thank you again for coming to speak to us today. My name is Aditya. I'm a first-year Master of Global Affairs student. And my question for you is around innovation. As someone emphasizing in innovation, I find your work quite compelling. You launched the Innovation Ride and the Governor General's Innovation Awards, and you were also a big proponent of the Innovation Cluster model, a notable one being Commutech in Waterloo. So looking back now, do you see the positive impacts that you envisioned when you conceptualized and implemented this plan? Do you think your renewed focus on commercialization of innovation has had the positive reverberating effects that you hoped it would?
Well, we certainly hope so. And in fact, with the Rita Hall Foundation, we work very hard on the culture of innovation. Innovation is just doing things better, an attitude of mind of curious, and how do we do things better? And it's not just technological innovation or business innovation, it's social innovation as well, doing things better. And to do things better, you have to have a critical mind. You have to have curiosity, you have to ask those questions all the time, and then you have to have some tenacity to put things together. And when we wrote the 2 innovation books, it was really out of concern that we needed more people thinking harder and doing more on how we make things better on a whole range of spheres. And how do we develop a culture in this country that is, how do we make things better? We do an annual survey at the Rita Hall Foundation on the understanding of innovation in the country. And the results come back that Canadians believe in innovators. We should be doing things better and be curious that way. But they fall short in saying, well, who does it and how do it? And it's usually what the governments do. Well, governments generally don't innovate. They try to create the environment to innovate, but it's individuals and people who take those particular ideas and then put so much effort into them. And how then do you create a culture of innovation in your country? Well, I think you begin with your young people who ask the question why almost as soon as they can begin to speak. And sometimes we parents say, well, stop bothering me with that why. Go and play in the yard or walk the dog or something like that, rather than cultivating that question of why, that constant curiosity, which then leads you to, gee, if I just sort of did this way, maybe something good would happen. And then having the wonderful satisfaction that you have when you really create things, something that does things better. There's no elixir like it, I think. And I believe it's also true in building institutions, which you do not simply by curiosity, but a great sense of collaboration, how you bring other people to the particular cause of doing this particular thing better, and enthusing them. I come to leadership, and for me, there are many definitions of leadership, but the one that's most important to me is leadership is recognizing your total dependence on the people around you, your team. Now that sounds trite. Find a parade that's going like this and get in the front of it, and you're a wonderful leader. Not so good when the parade kind of goes south on you. It's more ensuring there's an environment where all the people who are part of your team or your organization, et cetera, are encouraged and enabled to reach the very limits of their talent in terms of their contribution to the particular purpose. And guess what? When you reach the limits of their talents, they expand, et cetera. It's a wonderful reinforcing thing. But it's curiosity, it's collaboration, and being very focused on doing things better. And I say with technological innovation, let's have the finest engineers and physicists in the world, but let's try to be sure that there is a sense of we're doing these things better because they improve the human condition. I guess that's where the empathy comes in.
Dave Jones.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. My name's David Jones.
David.
Yes, hi.
How are you, brother?
Hi again, I'm well, thank you.
And Jones, where did you lost the T-O-N on the end of the name.
Yeah, we're almost related. So,
we're close.
I'm in the running for the next Governor General, apparently, so not sure about that.
I'll second the nomination.
Thank you. So,
unless it goes to your children who were saluting so well this morning, Peter.
They've got a ways to go.
So, to use a sporting analogy, which I hope will be close to your heart, the most successful athletes and teams compete very hard. So they're seeking to win and to be the best. So if we consider the federal government's approach to international negotiations, how can we integrate empathy into that approach, which doesn't leave us vulnerable to coming off second best?
Yeah, well, I guess I probably anticipated that, David, in my comment about win and lose, and that what you want is both parties winning in a good bargain. But I also say, I played, you grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, you play hockey, and you play football, and you play baseball, and we did. And it was a very cosmopolitan community. And you pretty quickly learned it wasn't the name on the back of the sweater, it was the name on the front of the sweater that's really important. And it didn't matter what culture or heritage or what language was spoken at home. Could you block and tackle? Could you pass the puck, et cetera, which became quite key. And many things you learn from team sports, collaboration in particular, but one of them is to learn how to win and to lose. To win gracefully rejoice, but don't think that somehow you're the conqueror of the world because of that victory, and learn how to lose. Graciously, not the right word, but losing is a part of life, and you learn to manage it as you learn to manage victory, and those are important lessons, I think, from team sports. But for me, perhaps the most important thing is to play well in a team. You have to discipline yourself, you have to train hard, you have to play hard and well within the rules. And above all, you have to realize that you're not the center of the universe. You're part of a team, and how you help other people succeed at least your level, better is good. And I think that applies to federal-provincial relations as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Let me turn to the audience if there are questions. You put up your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. And while we wait for that, please, right here. Yeah. Thanks very much. Sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue, monsieur.
C'est un plaisir de vous voir.
Merci. My name is Dave Doyen. When you were Governor General, how were you able to, or at least reflect on what empathy would look like from your role, because it's so far removed from the reality of people, and you don't get to affect policy in the way people would like?
Sure.
And the reason I ask that is, I remember when I just come to Canada from Jamaica, I met your predecessor, Madame Jean, who I work with now in the foundation. And Freddie Villanueva's mother was in the room, and she was pleading to Madame Jean for help because of the brutal killing of Freddie Villanueva, but there's only so much Madame Jean could do. Quite frankly, there's nothing Madame Jean could do. So what does empathy look like, or what did it look like in that role for you?
Well, knowing Madame Jean, I suspect she expressed certainly sympathy and maybe empathy within her power to do empathy, a natural graciousness that I think is important. The office of the Governor General, though, has no power, and by design. It's intended to be an independent, nonpartisan office with the business of government being handled by the head of government, and people are elected to tax us and to provide services, etc. The head of state is a different organ of government that has no power, and it has to do not with the business of government, but the dignity of government and the importance of protecting the Constitution and then these other fundamental values. So those, in a sense, are limitations. That said, we did a lot of things to try to reach out to different communities across the country and try to establish some recognition that would be important in that. One that was most important to me is called the Sovereign's Medal on Volunteerism, and I mentioned earlier about the importance of volunteers in healthy communities. Romeo LeBlanc was Governor General, 30 years or so ago. Small Acadian village, very modest circumstances. High school, took a one-year teacher certificate, became a teacher, then a journalist, then a member of Parliament, then Governor General. And the Office of Governor General is responsible for about 70 different honor systems. The one you probably know best is Order of Canada, the celebrated people who desire a better country and recognized. And he said, you know, these are wonderful, recognizing our Order of Canada people, but what about the unsung heroes who do wonderful work in the community day after day, year after year, and are never in any exalted position or publicized about it? They should be recognized as they were in my village in Acadia. So he started the Caring Canadian Award, and about 60 times a year he conferred this award on different Canadians. And then when I came in office, I said, you know, that's the bookend to Order of Canada, the unsung heroes. But it had been discontinued for about 10 years because of budget cuts. So one of the reasons we set up the Rito Hall Foundation in 2012 was to deal with budget cut situations. We raised $5 million to bulletproof that award, so it was back on. And we spoke to the Queen about it and said, would you elevate it from a Governor General Award to a Sovereign's Award, calling it the Queen Elizabeth Medal for Volunteerism? She said, yes, with delight, but don't call it the Queen Elizabeth Medal, call it the Sovereign's Medal, so it'll be there in perpetuity. And our last year in office, we awarded about 1,000 of those. We wanted to go up to 10,000 with the lieutenant governors and so on, awarding these. And we'll get there, we hope. But Sharon and I would go to these communities, and we'd have an Order of Canada ceremony and then a Sovereign Medal ceremony. And the individual who would be recognized with the citation would be very embarrassed and saying, well, why me? And what about the 30 other people who've been working on wheels and meals for the last 25 years or watering the local rink, et cetera? These people are really so important. And to me, what they do is empathetic. And you want to do everything in your power to encourage people to do what these sovereigns medal on volunteerism do. And I would tell a story, it's another story that comes from the Queen. She would speak about act of kindness. And she'd say a specific act of kindness is like dropping a pebble into a pond, and the ripples go all the way across the pond. They cover the whole. I tell a story of that kind we had 5 daughters, and we used to have birthday parties, and Dad would tell ghost stories at the birthday parties. And after one, our eldest daughter, who was then about 10, she says, Dad, you know, the ghost stories you tell at the birthday parties, the kids really aren't scared. They just pretend to be scared because they know your feelings would be hurt if they didn't pretend to be scared. Why can't you be like Dean McFarlane? He does magic at birthday parties. Well, I was Dean of Law at Western, and Andy McFarlane was Dean of Journalism. So, you know, you learn a thing when your children speak to you that way. So I go to a birthday party at the McFarlane home 3 or 4 months later, and here's Andy McFarlane dressed in a magician's costume, and he's got a handlebar mustache, and he's got a top hat, and he's doing card tricks, and the kids think he's just marvelous. And then he says, I will turn this glass of water into wine. And I said, careful, Andy, the last time that was done 2,000 years ago was someone had a little more influence than you do. Yeah. And in his sleeve, he had an eyedropper with 1 drop of red vegetable dye. He dropped that drop of vegetable dye in the water, and abracadabra shook it, and the red dye suffused the entire surface of the water. And before that, Mother Teresa had been in Montreal, and she gave a wonderful address. And the 4 Montreal newspapers, after she finished, 3 of them had very laudatory things, say she's a wonderful woman, she'll probably be canonized by the Roman Catholic Church, she was. But the 4th one, practicing real politics, said, look, Mother Teresa was here yesterday, she gave a wonderful address to the Montreal Greater Prayer Breakfast and spoke about her settlement house in Karachi, India, that helps 250 homeless families, et cetera, get on. Marvelous as it is, India, Karachi, is a city of 15 million people, half of whom are in desperate situations, not just those 250. In a country of 1 billion people, many of whom are in desperate situations. What she does is just a drop in the bucket, a drop in water. That bothered me a lot until I came along and saw Andy McFarlane turn water into wine. And I thought, you know, I had been looking at that drop in the bucket of Mother Teresa as a physical phenomenon, or perhaps something that you measure by mathematics. But if I looked at it as chemical engineering, the red vegetable dye interacting with the H2O molecules and turning them in different color, that's changing the whole culture or the circumstance. And that's the beauty of acts of kindness that get multiplied. And that's why I think, particularly in the representative of the head of state, you want to have empathetic personalities that encourage those acts of kindness right across the country and have a lot of ripples.
Ma'am, we'll go right here for one last question. Thank you very much.
Hello, hi.
You're on.
You're working.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Hear myself, but my name is Snežana Bošković. I'm the executive director of the Serbian Senior Group.
Yep.
I am recipient of Queen Diamond Jubilee Medal, and I have your signature on my plaque. So thank you for that. Now,
Do you know that's a real signature?
yeah, it's a real signature.
That's not a stamp.
I see it. I didn't bring it to show.
And I'll tell you that because I want to deal with, you know, there are some empathetic things you can do as Governor General. So there were 60,000 of those certificates. I signed every one.
I
Now
know.
you say, why did I do that? I do that not to think I'm a smart guy, but I wanted you to know that some human being had taken those references in the selections and actually put his hand on it to be able to say, bravo, we're proud of you.
Yeah,
Human.
well, I just want to tell you, we established with the New Horizon for Senior grant, we established Serbian Senior Helpline.
Yeah.
And that's a part of why I got that medal.
Sure.
And so we have seniors who are immigrant seniors who speak barely English, a little bit, but they offer their time on that senior line, and they speak with their fellow their peer seniors who are also lonely here. And we give them referrals. We sometimes hear terrible stories, and we are there for them 24/7. So just now, before I came here, I received a call from a social worker from Bradford who's saying, we have a Serbian lady hard of hearing, we don't know what to do, help us. So we try everything, and it resonates so much with your book. We brought it here, so if you can kindly just sign. People would be so happy to see your signature again.
That's an extraordinary story of what you're doing to help those people in such a fundamental way, helping them in their particular language.
Because in your book, you're saying that people who, mostly how I understood it, people who have a lot, they can give. But also people who don't have a lot can offer something. At least their time and their, I don't know, the compassion. That's
compassion,
what
that's
I
right.
can say.
Well, you know, the province in Canada that is the most compassionate, most empathetic, the highest number of volunteers, the highest per capita gifts of money as well as time, guess what? Newfoundland and Labrador. There's a message there. I want to tell you about what you're doing with the language issue. Our number 5 daughter, who's very assiduous in the terrible responsibility of raising her parents, especially her father, who needs much help. She said to me, it's in the book, she said, Dad, if I were the chair of the board at the University of Waterloo, I'd fire you. My daughter, I'd fire you. She says, you still let professors stand up there on the stage with their yellow notes and they lecture and the kids take the notes down and that's that. And don't you realize that's about 20% learning efficient? If you want to get up to 80% learning efficient, you have to have the kids apply that knowledge in some practical way that has consequences. So she was at McGill. All 5 of my daughters and my wife have McGill degrees. I don't. They say that Dad was always in the slow class. But I'm principal and I'm chairing Senate, and number 5 daughter is elected as a senator, and she comes in one day and she introduces a motion that the Russian language and literature course that she and about 10 other students are taking wants not only the 30-hour credit for taking the course and, as she would say, memorizing vocabulary and trying to understand Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in the original language, for a program that they started to put their knowledge into action, i.e. speaking the Russian. They struck an arrangement with the Russian Orthodox Church, which was on the extreme east of Montreal, had a seniors' home for Russian people who were there, about 250 or so, quite a number. And they went and they volunteered about 20 hours a week, helping them in English and French, to tax returns, to other documentation, et cetera, to writing letters for them, always in Russian. And they learned, unlike many language courses, that you learn to speak the language, not just to read the literature and to write things. So she said we should get the same credit for spending 20 hours a week actually putting this into language. And her father, of course, is sputtering from the chair. I mean, what about due process? You know, this has not gone through the department curriculum committee and the faculty curriculum committee and the Senate curriculum committee. We can't tolerate this. I didn't say that, but that's what I was feeling, was carried unanimously. But she was so right. You know, that way of learning is so much more important. But it began with their own empathetic notion of helping these people who needed their help, and at the same time, helped to master the language Russia. She then went out of McGill to Kaliningrad and taught in a Russian high school, English and French, for a year in 1991, just after the Berlin Wall fell. And she said, Dad, I was hanging on by my fingernails every day in this high school trying to teach English and French because there was so much chaos. That had been a defense center after World War II. Kaliningrad, East Prussia, separated from Russia itself. But she said it was the best year of my life because I learned how to be resilient, etc. And I think part of that was her own great sense of empathy, of reaching out and helping people where they need, and in so doing, very often improving their own skills and capacities. Bravo for what you do. I'm glad I signed that document. I remember it very well.
David, I think we could search for our whole lives and never find a person who's a better example of the best values of Canada. For me personally, but I think for everyone here, I'd say that it's an honor to have spent this time with you, and an honor to see the great example that you've set for all of us over the course of your whole life. So thank you so much for everything you've done, and especially for this last hour with us.
Peter, thank you.